We are taught that Japan closed itself off from the world for 250 years out of cultural pride and fear of foreign influence. We are told that Commodore Perry's black ships in 1854 forced open a hermit nation through superior military technology. But this is the story written by the victors. It ignores the cold, hard mathematics of empire. If you want to understand why Japan truly isolated itself and why it was forced to open, you have to look past the samurai and the gunboats. You have to look at the global silver trade. You have to understand that Japan didn't close its doors to the world. The world closed its wallet to Japan. And when that silver tap was turned off, the Shogunate faced a choice: adapt or starve. This is the story of how Japan became the richest nation on earth, and then watched that wealth slip through its fingers like mercury. It is the story of how a resource blessing became a resource curse. It is the story of how 250 years of isolation ended not with cannons, but with empty treasuries. And it is a warning about what happens when a nation builds its entire economy on a single commodity, and that commodity runs out. The empire built on silver. To understand Japan's tragedy, we must travel back to the year 1600, to the moment when Tokugawa Ieyasu unified Japan under his rule after the Battle of Sakigahara. The new shogun inherited a country that had been torn apart by over a century of civil war. But he also inherited something that would make Japan the envy of the world: the largest silver deposits on the planet, hidden in the mountains of Honshule, mines that produced more silver than the rest of the world combined. The Iwamegin-san mine alone was extracting silver, or so pure that it glowed in the dark. Japanese miners, using advanced techniques learned from Korean captives, were pulling mountains of precious metal from the earth. By 1600, Japan was producing roughly 1/3 of the world's silver. Think about that. An island nation smaller than California was supplying the global economy with its most precious currency. Silver was the oil of the medieval world. It was a universal medium of exchange, from Beijing to London. Spanish pieces of 8, minted from Peruvian silver, were the global reserve currency, but the Spanish had competition they didn't know about. Japanese silver was purer, more abundant, and easier to extract than anything coming from the Americas. The Tokugawa Shogunate quickly realized they were sitting on a gold mine, or rather, a silver mine. They established a strict monopoly over silver production. Every ounce had to be sold to the government first. They minted their own currency, the silver shogun, and began trading with the world on their own terms. Portuguese traders arrived in Japanese ports and found themselves facing not backward feudal lords, but sophisticated merchants who understood exactly what their silver was worth. For the first decades of the 17th century, Japan was the richest nation per capita on earth. Silver flowed out of the mines, and luxury goods flowed in. Japanese cities like Osaka and Edo grew to populations larger than London or Paris. The merchant class became wealthy beyond imagination. The samurai, paid in silver stipends, lived lives of unprecedented luxury. Japan was not isolated. It was the center of the world economy. But the shogun was watching the global markets carefully, and he didn't like what he saw. European traders were not just buying silver, they were bringing something else: Christianity. And behind Christianity came European political influence. The Spanish had conquered the Philippines. The Portuguese had colonized Macau. The Dutch had seized Indonesia. Everywhere European silver buyers went, European flags soon followed. The shogun faced a strategic dilemma that would define the next 250 years. How do you sell to the world without being conquered by it? How do you maintain your wealth without losing your sovereignty? The solution they chose was radical: controlled isolation. Not complete isolation, but selective engagement on Japanese terms. The Sokoku system, the world's first economic firewall in 1633. The Tokugawa Shogunate implemented the Sokoku policy, which translates as closed country. But this translation is misleading. Japan didn't close itself off from trade. It created the world's most sophisticated trade monopoly. Think of it as the first national firewall, designed to let money in while keeping political influence out. The policy was brilliantly crafted. All European traders, except the Dutch, were Christianity was banned and its followers persecuted. Japanese citizens were forbidden from traveling abroad. But crucially, trade continued. The Dutch were allowed to maintain a single trading post on the artificial island of Dejima, in Nagasaki harbor. This tiny island, connected to the mainland by a single guarded bridge, became Japan's only window to the global economy. The Dutch were chosen for a reason. Unlike the Spanish and Portuguese, they were Protestant, not Catholic. They were merchants, not missionaries. They wanted silver, not souls. The Dutch East India Company, the world's first multinational corporation, was happy to play by Japanese rules as long as the silver kept flowing. The system was economically brilliant. Japan controlled every aspect of the trade relationship. Dutch ships could only anchor at Dutch traders could only deal with government-approved merchants. All prices were set by Japanese authorities. The silver that left Japan was immediately converted into goods that Japan needed: Chinese silk, Indonesian spices, European firearms, and scientific instruments. For decades, the system made Japan even richer. The Shogunate was getting the best of both worlds: access to global markets without foreign interference. The Dutch made enormous profits, but they were junior partners in a relationship dictated entirely by Tokyo. Japan was not isolated from the world economy. It was controlling it. But the foundations of this prosperity were beginning to crack. The silver mines that had made Japan wealthy were not infinite, and the global demand for silver was about to shift in ways that would undermine everything the Shogunate had built. The resource curse strikes by the early 1700s. Japanese silver production was already declining. The richest veins had been exhausted. The deeper mines were harder to work and more dangerous. Output was falling year by year, but the global economy was still hungry for silver, and new sources were coming online. Spanish silver from Potosa, in Bolivia, was flooding global markets. Mexican mines were producing massive quantities of high-grade ore. Most critically, new smelting techniques using mercury amalgamation were allowing the Spanish to extract silver more efficiently than ever before. Japanese silver, once the premium product in the global marketplace, was being undercut by cheaper, more abundant supply from the Americas. The economics were brutal. Why would a Chinese silk merchant or a Dutch spice trader pay premium prices for Japanese silver when Spanish silver was readily available at lower cost? The global market was turning away from Japan not because of politics or culture, but because of simple supply and demand. The shogunates tried to compensate by devaluing their currency, reducing the silver content of their coins, but this only accelerated the outflow of high-quality silver while flooding the domestic market with debased currency. Inflation began to eat away at the prosperity that silver had built. By 1750, Japan was no longer a net exporter of silver. The mines were producing just enough for domestic needs. The great silver boom that had funded Japanese isolation was coming to an end, but the shogunate had built an entire political and economic system around controlling silver exports. What happens when you have nothing left to export? The answer was economic stagnation. The rigid class system that had been sustainable when silver was flowing became a burden when it dried up. The samurai class, maintained by government stipends, became an expensive liability. The merchant class, deprived of silver to trade, began to decline. The elaborate bureaucracy that managed the Sikoku system became a costly anachronism. Japan was still technically isolated, but it was no longer profitable isolation. It was the isolation of irrelevance. The world had moved on. New trade routes were being established that bypassed Japan entirely. The Dutch still came to Dejima, but the cargoes were smaller and the profits thinner. Japan was becoming what it had never intended to be: actually isolated. The world discovers Japan is broke. While Japan was stagnating behind its walls, the world outside was undergoing revolutionary change. The Industrial Revolution was transforming European and American economies. Steam power was replacing sail. Factory production was replacing craft production. Most importantly, new forms of wealth were being created that didn't depend on precious metals. In the counting houses of London and Boston, merchants were looking at maps of the Pacific and seeing opportunity. Japan, they realized, was not a mysterious hermit kingdom. It was a potential market of 30 million consumers who had been cut off from global trade for 200 years. Think about the pent-up demand. Think about the profits to be made selling manufactured goods to a pre-industrial economy. But it was American industrialists who saw the biggest opportunity. The United States had completed its continental expansion. American factories were producing more goods than American markets could absorb. They needed new customers, and Japan looked like the prize of the Pacific. The Americans had another advantage. They understood that Japan's isolation was economic, not just cultural. American whaling ships operating in the Pacific had been observing Japanese coastal activities for decades. They had seen the decline in silver production. They had noticed the growing poverty in Japanese fishing villages. They knew that Japan's economy was stagnating. Commodore Perry's mission in 1853 was not primarily military. It was commercial. The 4 black ships that entered Tokyo Bay were not conquerors. They were traveling salesmen, backed by the world's most dynamic industrial economy. Perry's letter to the shogun was not a declaration of war. It was a business proposal. The letter was brilliantly crafted. It appealed to Japanese self-interest, not American strength. It pointed out that Japan was missing out on the benefits of global trade. It suggested that isolation was making Japan weaker, not stronger. It offered American friendship and American markets for Japanese goods. But the most persuasive argument was not in the letter. It was in the ships themselves. These were steam-powered vessels that could travel faster and farther than any Japanese ship. They carried manufactured goods that Japanese craftsmen could not match. They represented an industrial civilization that had left Japan behind. The Shogunate's advisors looked at Perry's ships and realized the terrible truth. Japan had fallen catastrophically behind. During 250 years of isolation, the rest of the world had learned to create wealth through manufacturing and trade. Japan had grown rich from silver, but when the silver ran out, they had no other source of prosperity. The economics of surrender. The negotiations that followed Perry's arrival were not really about military threats or cultural exchange. They were about economics. The Americans wanted access to Japanese markets. The Japanese needed access to American technology and capital. The Treaty of Kanagawa, signed in 1854, was framed as a diplomatic agreement between equals. But the economic reality was different. Japan was being forced to integrate into a global economy that had developed without them. They were entering the game 250 years late, and the rules had already been written by others. The immediate effects were devastating. When Japanese ports opened to foreign trade, American and European manufactured goods flooded in. These products were cheaper, better made, and more abundant than anything Japanese craftsmen could produce. Traditional industries collapsed overnight. Unemployment soared. The social order that had been stable for centuries began to disintegrate. But the most revealing change was in Japan's trade balance. For the first time in centuries, Japan was importing more than it was exporting. Silver that had once flowed out of the country as payment for luxury goods was now flowing in as payment for necessities. Japan had become what it had never been before, economically dependent on the outside world. The samurai class, already struggling with reduced stipends, found their wealth collapsing. Their military skills were obsolete. Their administrative roles were redundant. The merchants who had grown wealthy under the Sakoku system were being outcompeted by foreign traders with better products and deeper pockets. Young Japanese intellectuals began to study Western economics and technology with desperate intensity. They realized that Japan had to modernize or be colonized. The choice was stark: adapt to the new global economy or become another European colony like India or Indonesia. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 was the result. The shogunate was overthrown not by foreign armies, but by Japanese reformers who understood that the old system was economically unsustainable. The new Meiji governance slogan was Fukoku-ki, a rich country, strong army. But the emphasis was on rich country. They knew that in the modern world, economic strength was the foundation of all other forms of power. The race to catch up. What happened next was one of the most remarkable economic transformations in history. Japan didn't just open to the world. It systematically reverse-engineered Western industrial civilization and then improved upon it. The Meiji government sent missions to Europe and America to study everything: factories, banks, railroads, telegraphs, schools, armies. They hired thousands of foreign experts to teach Japanese workers Western techniques. They built modern infrastructure with borrowed capital. Most importantly, they created a creative education system designed to produce engineers and entrepreneurs, not just scholars and bureaucrats. The speed of change was breathtaking. Within 30 years, Japan had gone from a feudal economy based on rice and silver to an industrial economy based on steel and machinery. By 1900, Japanese factories were competing with European factories in global markets. By 1905, the Japanese Navy was defeating the Russian Navy in the Russo-Japanese War. The transformation was funded by exactly the kind of economic policies that the shogunate had avoided for 250 years. Japan borrowed heavily from foreign banks. It encouraged foreign investment in Japanese industries. It sent its brightest students to study abroad. It embraced the global economy completely. But the most ironic aspect of Japan's modernization was how it used its historical experience of isolation. Japanese leaders had learned to be selective about what they imported from the West. They took Western technology and economic systems, but they adapted them to Japanese conditions. They modernized without losing their cultural identity. The silver curse had been broken not by finding new silver mines, but by learning to create wealth in new ways. Japan discovered that in the modern world, human capital was more valuable than natural resources. Education, organization, and technology could generate more prosperity than any mine. Temodar Echo. The story of Japan as forced opening resonates powerfully today because we are witnessing similar dynamics in the modern global economy. Countries that rely heavily on commodity exports face the same dilemma that Japan faced in the 1600s. How to maintain prosperity when commodity prices fall or resources are depleted. Look at Venezuela, a nation that built its modern economy on oil exports. When oil prices collapsed, the entire system collapsed with it. Look at Russia, still struggling to diversify beyond energy exports, despite decades of economic sanctions. Look at Saudi Arabia, desperately trying to build a post-oil economy through massive infrastructure investments. The lesson of Japanese isolation is not that countries should avoid global integration. It's that countries should avoid overdependence on any single source of wealth. Diversification is not just an economic strategy. It's a survival strategy. Modern China has learned this lesson well. Despite becoming the world's manufacturing center, Chinese leaders are constantly worried about being trapped in low-value production. They are investing heavily in technology, education, and high-value services. They remember what happened to countries that became too dependent on exporting raw materials to more advanced economies. The other lesson is about the relationship between economic and political sovereignty. Japan's isolation was an attempt to maintain political independence while participating in global trade. It worked for a while, but ultimately proved unsustainable. In today's interconnected world, true isolation is impossible. The choice is not between isolation and integration. It's between smart integration and dumb integration. Countries that integrate successfully maintain control over their economic destiny. They develop their own technologies, build their own brands, and create their own competitive advantages. Countries that integrate poorly become dependent suppliers of raw materials or cheap labor to more advanced economies. Japan's story is ultimately one of successful adaptation. They lost their silver, but they gained something more valuable: the knowledge of how to create wealth through human effort and ingenuity. When the silver mines ran dry, Japanese civilization didn't collapse. It transformed. The black ships that arrived in 1854 were not conquering Japan. They were offering Japan a choice: evolve or become extinct. Japan chose evolve. The result was not the end of Japanese civilization, but its rebirth as a modern industrial power. The shogun, who signed the first trade treaties, probably thought he was presiding over Japan's defeat. In reality, he was laying the foundation for Japan's greatest victory: the transformation from a silver-dependent feudal state to an industrial powerhouse that would eventually challenge and defeat the very Western powers that had forced it to open. The silver curse was broken not by finding more silver, but by learning that silver was never the real source of wealth. The real source of wealth was always the creativity, discipline, and ingenuity of the Japanese people. When they were finally unleashed on the global economy, they didn't just compete. They conquered. Japan's 250 years of isolation ended not with military defeat, but with economic opportunity. The doors that Perry forced open didn't lead to conquest. They led to prosperity. Sometimes the greatest victories come disguised as defeats, and sometimes the most profitable surrender is the decision to stop fighting change and start embracing it. The lesson echoes through history. Nations that build their prosperity on a single resource are building their prosperity on sand. When that resource is depleted or devalued, the entire structure collapses. But nations that build their prosperity on human capital, on knowledge, on adaptability, these nations can weather any storm and emerge stronger. I'm John, and this is the Cinematic History Tallies channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming. The next economic transformation is already beginning, and the nations that understand the lessons of Japan is silver. Curse will be the ones that survive and thrive in the world to come.